My name is Jenna Carter. I am 31 years old, and coming home has never been simple for me. That evening, I returned for my mother's birthday dinner. I told myself it would be fine, that it was just a meal, that I could smile my way through it like I always had. I even brought her favorite cake, the one from the little bakery downtown, where the line wraps around the block before sunrise. I carried it inside, carefully placed it on the table, and took my seat with a quiet hope that maybe, just maybe this time, would be different. The room was warm with conversation at first. Familiar voices, familiar rhythms. Then, without warning or hesitation, my older sister pushed her chair back slightly, looked at me from across the table, and said, clear and smooth as if she had rehearsed it, "Actually, nobody here even likes you." There was a moment where time should have stopped, where someone should have gasped or objected or at least looked confused. Instead, I watched the corners of my parents' mouths curl in a way that told me they had known those words long before they were spoken. It was a quiet confirmation of something I had always felt, but never wanted to believe. I did not defend myself. I did not demand an explanation. My hands were steady as I cut one last bite of cake, lifted it to my mouth, tasted the sweetness, and set the fork down. I told them to enjoy the rest of their evening and walked out the front door without once looking back. 3 weeks later, I received a call. The voice on the other end was rushed afraid, telling me that my family was in serious trouble. I answered softly, "I know." Before I continue, tell me this. If it were you sitting at that table, what would you have done? And also, you're watching this from where and at what time of day? I want to know how far this story travels. A few years before that night, the shift in our family began gradually, almost quietly, like a door closing 1 inch at a time. I was working steadily, then moving up in my field, building a life that felt stable, even if it was mostly quiet and private. At the same time, my sister Mallory was trying to figure out what direction she wanted her life to take. She moved from one idea to another, each one beginning with excitement and ending in exhaustion. But our parents always spoke of her with a kind of hopeful insistence, as if the next plan would certainly be the one that transformed everything. One afternoon, I received a call from my mother, Helen. Her voice carried that light, persuasive tone she used when she had already made up her mind and only needed me to agree. She said the family had been discussing a new opportunity for Mallory, something with more stability and a sense of purpose. She told me they had found a space downtown that would be perfect for a small café, something charming, something that could become a warm gathering place for the neighborhood. I remember her saying that Mallory just needed a chance to prove herself, that all she required was for someone to believe in her the way family is meant to. When I asked how I was involved, my mother explained that the bank loan would be easier to secure if it was in my name. She spoke of it like it was a logical step, something simple and reasonable. My father, Walter, echoed her sentiment, saying that families are supposed to lift one another up, especially sisters. There was no accusation in his tone, yet the message was clear. If I refused, I would be the one disrupting the unity they valued so deeply. I hesitated, not because I doubted Mallory entirely, but because I understood the weight of responsibility they were asking me to carry. Still, I wanted peace in the family. I wanted to be supportive. So I agreed to sign the loan papers and provide the financial foundation for the cafe. We signed the documents a week later, and I remember Mallory hugging me with a bright smile, thanking me with an excitement that felt sincere at the time. The cafe opened a few months later. It had warm lights, a polished espresso bar, and shelves lined with small potted plants that Mallory said made the space feel alive. She took on the role of manager, greeting customers, designing menus, and curating the atmosphere. I worked behind the scenes, handling invoices, negotiating supplier contracts, and checking that the loan payments were steady. I did not mind staying invisible. I liked knowing that things were running smoothly because I made sure they did. In the beginning, there was a sense of shared accomplishment. Our parents praised Mallory for her initiative, her creativity, and her determination to build something meaningful. I was glad for her even when my contribution was not mentioned. I told myself that the point of helping family was not to be acknowledged, but to ensure the success of the people you care about. I believed that deeply. Over time, the cafe gained a small but loyal customer base. People in the neighborhood liked the atmosphere, the drinks, and the way Mallory remembered their names. I saw her confidence growing each week. I watched her take ownership of the place with a focus I had never seen in her before. It made me hopeful that things were finally settling into something healthy and balanced for all of us. But what I did not understand then was how quickly gratitude can fade when people begin to believe that what they were given was always theirs to begin with. The shift happened slowly at first, too subtle to name. I did not know it yet, but the foundation of everything that would follow had already been laid. 3 months passed, and the cafe was no longer the quiet, uncertain experiment it had been in the beginning. The morning line formed before the doors even opened, a line of familiar faces who had made our place part of their routine. Students stayed through the afternoons, typing, chatting, drinking iced coffee that dripped condensation onto the tables. The steady sound of conversation and the soft hum of the espresso machine blended into something I once thought of as proof that we had built something meaningful. Mallory was at the center of that atmosphere. She moved behind the counter with practiced ease, greeting customers by name, asking about their day, remembering small stories they had mentioned once. I could see how people gravitated toward her. They saw her as the heart of the cafe, the person who made the space feel warm. Meanwhile, I worked at the small desk in the back hallway, balancing supplier invoices, filling out payroll, double-checking order quantities for the next week. The kind of work that has no audience and receives no applause, but without it, the place would collapse within days. At first, I believed we both understood that our roles, though different, were equally valuable. But the narrative began to change so slowly that I almost missed the moment it shifted. When customers complimented the cafe, Mallory smiled as if every part of it had sprung from her hands alone. She stopped acknowledging the nights we spent planning the spreadsheets, the loan signed under my name. I told myself it was not important who received credit as long as we were stable. It was easier to believe that than to confront what was happening. Mom started visiting more frequently. She would sit near the counter speaking with customers, resting her hand on Mallory's arm in a way that suggested admiration and maternal pride. I overheard her describe the cafe as something Mallory built from the ground up. When someone looked toward me, Mom would laugh and say lightly that I was just helping out when I had time, as though my involvement were optional, casual, peripheral. The first time I heard that, something in my chest tightened. I glanced at Mallory, waiting for her to correct the story to include me in the reality we both lived. But Mallory kept her eyes on the milk frother, smiling politely, accepting the praise without hesitation. She chose the version of the story where I did not matter. Dad picked up the same narrative soon after. When relatives or neighbors asked about the cafe, he praised Mallory's determination and creativity. He spoke about her vision and her leadership. I listened in silence each time, wondering whether they had forgotten the loan statement that still arrived addressed to me every month. The payments came from my account. The risk rested on my future. But none of that found its way into their retelling. Over time, decisions began happening without me. Mallory adjusted the menu, redecorated the seating area, changed suppliers, and I only learned of these changes when I saw the results myself. When I tried to ask why, Mallory's expression shifted into something cool and detached, as if my questions were an intrusion instead of a reasonable expectation. I realized that she no longer viewed me as part of the cafe, even though I was the one who had made its existence possible. There were no arguments, no open confrontation, just a quiet process of being replaced in a space I had helped create. I found myself walking through the cafe some days and feeling like a visitor, someone who was tolerated but no longer included. I began to understand that exclusion wrapped in politeness hurts in a way that open cruelty never could. 6 months passed before I realized how far the distance had grown. The cafe continued to thrive, drawing a steady crowd from the neighboring blocks and the community college nearby. Mallory carried herself with a new confidence, almost theatrical. She walked with her chin slightly raised, her movements deliberate, as if everyone in the room were watching and admiring her, and they often were. One afternoon, I stopped by the flower shop next door to pick up a small arrangement for one of our regular customers who had just graduated. The shop owner, Mrs. Dawson, smiled at me with a warmth I usually welcomed, but that day her expression shifted into something hesitant. She lowered her voice while handing me the bouquet. She said that Mallory had been telling customers and nearby shop owners that I had only signed some papers and had no real part in the cafe's success. Mrs. Dawson tried to soften the impact, saying she assumed it was just casual talk. But the words settled in my stomach like something heavy and cold. Later that week, my best friend Tessa stopped by my apartment after her shift. She had heard the same thing from two regular customers who visited us often. They repeated Mallory's phrasing almost word for word. I listened quietly as Tessa spoke, and I could see the frustration in her eyes as she tried to defend me as if it mattered in the face of the story Mallory was determined to tell. I thanked her for telling me, though I did not know what to do with the information yet. I needed time to understand why Mallory wanted not only credit, but erasure. The answer revealed itself at Mom's birthday dinner. We gathered at my parents' house, the same dining room where we had celebrated every holiday of my childhood. The table was set beautifully with candles, polished silverware, and a cake placed in the center. I brought a gift, something thoughtful, something that showed attention. Mallory arrived with a bouquet almost the size of a small tree, wrapped in dramatic ribbons. Mom clapped her hands and embraced Mallory as if greeting a beloved celebrity. Dad nodded approvingly from his seat, already pouring Mallory a glass of wine. During dinner, conversations circled around the cafe. Mom praised Mallory's hard work and leadership, repeating the same tone I had heard in the cafe weeks earlier. The pattern was familiar now. When someone turned to include me, Mallory spoke lightly as though clarifying a harmless misunderstanding. She said that I had simply handled a few papers because I liked to feel helpful. Her voice was smooth, pleasant, almost affectionate. The room chuckled softly, accepting the narrative because it was easy and convenient. I looked at her without responding because any defense I offered would be dismissed as bitterness. Then it happened. Mallory leaned back in her chair, resting her wine glass casually between her fingers, and said with a smile that did not reach her eyes, "Actually, nobody here even likes you." Likes. The room froze for a breath before my parents laughed. Not loudly, not cruelly, but with a familiarity that told me this was not the first time they had thought it. It was simply the first time someone had said it out loud. The sound of their laughter felt like a confirmation of something I had suspected, but never allowed myself to believe. I did not ask why. I did not argue. I did not try to explain my place in the story of our family or the cafe. I simply took the last bite of cake on my plate, tasting almost nothing, and stood. My chair made a small sound against the hardwood floor, quiet yet final. I wished Mom a happy birthday, my voice steady and calm. Then I left. The house remained filled with laughter behind me, but something in me had closed. There are moments when love ends not with shouting but with silence. 2 weeks passed after that dinner. The silence between us was not discussed, but it was there, sitting underneath every conversation, every text message from my mother that ended in a heart emoji, every casual comment my father made that pretended nothing had happened. I continued to work at my job during the day and handled the cafe's finances in the evening, as I had always done, because even after everything, I still wanted to believe that the situation could be salvaged if I simply stayed consistent and adult about it. It was a quiet attempt at peace, even if no one else seemed interested in maintaining it. One evening, while updating the monthly expense sheets, I noticed a discrepancy. The numbers were not wildly off, Not dramatic enough to immediately raise alarms to someone who did not know the cafe's rhythm, but I had built every part of the budgeting system myself, so the inconsistency felt loud to me. Purchases categorized vaguely, charges that did not match supplier patterns, and a steady withdrawal of small amounts that accumulated into something unmistakable over time. I went back through statements from previous months, aligning each entry, and the pattern repeated itself with uncomfortable clarity. The cafe's revenue was being used for expenses that had nothing to do with business operations: hair appointments, clothing boutiques, a weekend getaway charge, all linked back to Mallory. I didn't confront her immediately. I sat with it, letting the disappointment move through my chest slowly, because reacting in anger would only reinforce the narrative she had crafted about me being difficult and ungrateful. Instead, I went to the one person who should have cared about fairness: my mother. I asked her if she knew that Mallory had been using business funds for personal purchases. For a moment, there was silence. Then she adjusted her glasses and said that I was reading too deeply into things, that running a business came with little conveniences, and that I should not make Mallory feel embarrassed or unsupported. When I brought it up to my father later that week, hoping at least for neutrality, he sighed, as though I were creating unnecessary problems. He told me that I was turning something small into something dramatic, and that family should not keep score. His tone was final, the kind that signaled the conversation had already been decided before I entered it. Their siding with Mallory was not loud or hostile, but it was absolute, and it landed with more weight than any direct insult could have. I realized then that I had spent years trying to earn a position in a family dynamic that refused to evolve. They did not want fairness, they wanted convenience. I had been useful when I signed the contracts, when I handled the legal documents, when I quietly ensured that bills were paid on time. But now that the cafe was running smoothly and Mallory had found a role that made her feel admired, my part was meant to fade into the background again. I was supposed to disappear. So I stopped explaining. I stopped expecting anyone in the house to understand the position they had placed me in. I began to gather documents, account statements, communication records, everything that proved my role was not only legitimate but essential. I spoke with a lawyer, not out of anger but clarity. The cafe was legally under my name, and the financial trail confirmed where the boundaries had been crossed. I did not announce what I planned to do. I simply prepared quietly, steadily, and without apology. The line had already been drawn. I was finally choosing which side of it to stand on. One weekend morning, the air felt unusually still, as if the day itself understood that something irreversible was about to take place. I arrived at the cafe before opening hours, holding a folder that contained everything I had quietly gathered over the previous weeks. Mallory was already inside, adjusting display stands and humming to herself, completely unaware that the dynamic she had grown so comfortable in was about to change in a way she could not control. I sat down at one of the tables and asked her to join me for a moment, using a tone that did not invite argument or delay. She hesitated, but eventually sat across from me, her expression open and relaxed, the expression of someone who believed they had already won. I slid the documents toward her, explaining with slow and deliberate clarity that I was withdrawing my financial support and revoking her access to business accounts. The ownership structure, legal responsibilities, and operational authority were outlined clearly in those papers. Mallory's face shifted in a way I had never seen before. The confidence she wore like a second skin began to fracture. She reached for justifications, excuses, emotional appeals, anything to restore the imbalance that had favored her for so long. Her voice rose, but mine did not. I told her that the decision was final, that it was based on documented misuse of business funds, and that I had already consulted legal counsel. Within an hour, Mom and Dad arrived, summoned by Mallory's frantic calls. Mom entered first, eyes already wet, insisting that this situation was simply a misunderstanding between sisters that could be resolved if I would just soften my stance. She held my hands and pleaded with a shaking voice, repeating that family was more important than any contract or bank statement. I listened, but I did not bend. When I reminded her of the months of ignored warnings and the way my concerns were dismissed, she looked away, unwilling to acknowledge the role she had played in letting the situation deepen. Dad's reaction was sharper. He accused me of tearing the family apart, of choosing pride over unity. His tone carried disappointment so practiced that it almost sounded sincere. Yet beneath his words, I recognized something else: fear. I had always been the one who quietly handled the unglamorous responsibilities, the one who made sure the foundation did not crumble. Without me in that position, the structure they relied on was vulnerable. I did not raise my voice, nor did I try to justify my decision any further. I simply stated that if family unity depended on my silence and exploitation, then it was never unity to begin with. When they realized my resolve was not going to break, the conversation fell apart. Mom cried. Dad paced. Mallory stared at me as though I had undone her life. No one acknowledged the choices that had led to this moment. No one took responsibility. They simply reacted to the consequences. By Monday, Mallory no longer had access to the cafe's funds or administrative systems. The business stalled almost immediately. Suppliers called, payments failed to process, schedules could not be maintained. Customers noticed the disarray and the once lively atmosphere dimmed. I did not celebrate it. I simply observed it, the direct outcome of a structure that had relied on my invisible labor, now revealed by the absence of it. There was no dramatic confrontation, no final exchange of cruel words, no sense of triumph. Only clarity. I had drawn the boundary. I was standing on my side of it. And there was no going back. A few weeks passed. The rhythm of the town continued as though nothing monumental had occurred, yet subtle shifts began to surface. I no longer visited the cafe each evening. The financial accounts were no longer quietly stabilized in the background. The systems I had built and maintained did not run themselves. At first, it was simply late payments. Vendors who had once been flexible began calling more frequently, leaving firm reminders instead of friendly check-ins. Simple supply orders were delayed or mismatched. Machines that required scheduled servicing began to malfunction. These disruptions might have looked like coincidences to an outsider, but to someone who understood the operational backbone, the cause was unmistakable. The cafe had always depended on a structure that no one else had taken the time to learn. Without that structure, the pace of decline quickened. Customers noticed changes as well. The once warm environment felt scattered, unfocused. Mallory tried to compensate with enthusiasm, posting promotional messages and speaking loudly to visitors as if volume could replace stability. But reputations in small-town communities tend to move quietly and quickly, shaped not by announcements but by consistency. When consistency disappeared, so did trust. I heard through the usual channels that foot traffic had slowed considerably. Chairs sat empty during hours that once bustled with conversation and movement. The energy had shifted and everyone could feel it. Mom and Dad did not speak to me directly about the decline. Instead, I received fragmented messages woven into casual, almost rehearsed tones. Comments about how businesses go through phases or how family members should support each other, especially during difficult times, each delivered as if history had not happened exactly as it did. Their version of events rewrote cause and effect. In their narrative, my decision to withdraw support came first, and the financial collapse was merely the consequence of my unwillingness to sacrifice further. The truth, however, was clear to anyone willing to examine it. The collapse had begun long before I stepped back. It had started the moment my work was taken for granted. One afternoon, Tessa visited me. Her role in my life had never been to solve problems, but rather to reflect clarity when I needed grounding. She did not arrive with dramatics or urgency. She simply knocked, stepped inside, and sat with the kind of silence that respects presence rather than rushes to fill it. After a few minutes, she told me something I had already suspected. Mallory had been telling anyone who would listen that I had abandoned her, that I was jealous, petty, vindictive. The story was unoriginal. It relied on old assumptions and familiar emotional biases. Tessa watched my face carefully, waiting to see if the words unsettled me. They did not. The truth did not need defending. Within another week, the café closed. There was no announcement. It simply stopped opening its doors. The windows remained dark during hours that once held light. The sign out front stayed in place, but the absence behind it said everything that needed to be said. The town did not erupt into gossip or spectacle. It simply adjusted and continued. The fall of a structure built on uneven ground rarely makes noise when it collapses. It settles. During this time, I made preparations of my own. I found a small apartment 2 towns over, closer to my workplace, quieter, with morning light that filtered softly through linen curtains. I packed my belongings slowly, intentionally, not with the urgency of escape, but with the certainty of transition. There were no dramatic goodbyes. No one asked where I was going. No one tried to stop me. I left with what had always been mine, my steadiness, my clarity, and the understanding that peace is something one chooses, not something one waits to be given. Time moved forward with a kind of gentle steadiness, not marked by dramatic milestones, but by the slow settling of my own breathing. In the new apartment, mornings were quiet except for the soft hum of the heater and the muted sounds of a neighborhood waking up at its own pace. I arranged the space carefully. I chose where each piece of furniture should go, not out of attachment to objects, but out of the desire to create a life shaped entirely by my own decisions. On a small shelf near the window, I placed one item with particular care, a small painted card that Avery had given me years ago. She had been much younger then, still full of the softness that precedes comparison and hierarchy. The card showed a sky with uneven watercolor clouds and a single line of text written in her careful handwriting to Jenna, because you always make things better. The paint had faded in places, the edges slightly curled, yet it retained a warmth untouched by the events that followed. It reminded me that not every moment in that house was defined by conflict. There had been laughter, ordinary afternoons, shared meals, small kindnesses. Those memories did not excuse what came later, but they existed alongside it. Human relationships are rarely singular stories. They are composite layers of tenderness and harm, loyalty, and blindness, effort, and neglect. I kept the card where sunlight could touch it. Not to cling to the past, but to honor the parts of myself that had been genuine, patient, and giving. I did not regret loving my family. The regret lay only in how long I allowed love to replace boundaries. I thought often about what responsibility means, particularly in relation to the people who share our history. There is a kind of responsibility that nurtures connection built on mutual care and respect. There is another kind that consumes, expecting one person to hold the weight of everyone else's comfort. For many years, I confused the second for the first. I believed that endurance was proof of love, that if I stayed long enough, gave enough, tried enough, the balance would one day correct itself. But some structures are not built to balance. Some people prefer the comfort of someone else's silence, rather than the discomfort of self-reflection. Leaving was not the moment I abandoned my family. It was the moment I stopped abandoning myself. Life in the new town unfolded with an ease that surprised me. I learned the rhythm of the local market, chose new coffee beans from a vendor who told stories about each roast, walked paths that curved along the riverbank, and allowed my world to expand beyond the walls of what I once believed I had to endure. I was not happy every day. Healing does not move in straight lines, but there was room to breathe, and that was enough to begin. Boundaries are not a form of selfishness, nor are they a rejection of love. They are a recognition of personal worth and the understanding that care cannot exist without mutual respect. No one has the right to demand your silence, your labor, or your forgiveness simply because they are family. Protecting your well-being does not diminish the love you have given. It allows you to choose relationships that are healthy, reciprocal, and human. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this story. Each person holds their own history of family loyalty and the search for belonging. If something in this journey resonated with you, I welcome you to share your thoughts or your own experiences in the comments. Your voice matters, and your perspective is meaningful here. I appreciate your presence.